you will put in greater and heavier investments. You will put in capital-intensive investments. You're not going to do that if you're at risk of losing that. If it costs you $1 million to set up just a simple assembly versus putting in a $450 million facility, which actually makes the plastics that then are assembled, you're going to want to do that in a free trade country. But what happens is suddenly your supply of the inputs for that plastics factory are no longer coming from the United States because that company went bankrupt. And it's certainly not in the new country where you put your investment. You've got to get it from somewhere. So having this linkage and being able to pull the countries together is definitely an improvement, but we're not quite there. The other thing for folks to know is when you are looking at the rules of origin, there's annexes. And every tariff line, just quickly, briefly, every product that comes to the United States has a 10-digit classification number. It's in a book called the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States. It's about that thick? I think it's about that thick. So if you're trying to find out what you've got to look in that book. Those annexes have all those numbers out there, and they tell you what the rule of origin is. It's called a product-specific rule of origin. One thing to know, though, is those numbers on which this agreement were negotiated are from 2007. So these are tariff numbers that were in place when we were using the tariff schedule of 2007. A new tariff schedule was put in place in 2012, and a newer tariff schedule will be put in place in 2017. So if you go looking for your product and it's classified in 2002.20.20.20, and you look in this annex and it's not there, don't panic. You just have to think about going back to where was this classified back in 2007, or just 2011. Because 2012 will change. So that's something you need to be aware of. Same thing in the market access when you're looking to say, well, when is my good going to get duty-free? Because not everything is duty-free immediately. There's all these different phase-out schedules. I think 32 different options for getting something in duty-free. From duty-free immediately to duty-free 13 years later, 25 years later, and something all in between. So there's lots of options for getting duty-free. Those also, when you're looking at the tariff numbers, don't correlate. And surprisingly, we found some numbers that we don't know where they came from. So we're hoping those are just typos. But you might see something and go, well, I've just never heard of that number. It's okay. The legal scrubs are happening, and hopefully some of these made-up numbers will get fixed. The other thing is when you're making a good, you have to ship directly from the country. This has been a problem for some FTAs. For example, we've had some interpretation discussions with the Koreans because many U.S. goods, when they're going into the ASEAN region, they will pass through Singapore. In Singapore, they may be moved around, and you may have sent a 40-foot container over there, but you're only going to send a 20-foot container from Singapore on into Korea. Well, the Koreans have at times interpreted that what happened in Singapore means it was not a direct export. The goods were not under the customs control of the Singapore government. Therefore, you do not ship directly. You don't get duty-free treatment under the FTA. So there's all these rules that are in there in the customs section that are applied to the rules of origin in the customs chapter that you have to be aware of. Again, having 12 countries, it's going to be interesting to see how everybody interprets it. Documentations requirements are a little bit different from some of the other countries. Some of the companies that you may work for are used to shipping under the NAFTA, or they're used to shipping under the Australia FTA, or the Morocco FTA, or whatever it is. This is a little bit different. This has self-certification, which means the importer can certify that this is a qualifying good, the exporter can certify that it's a qualifying good, or the producer can do it. And that's different. And there's no form. There is no form, there is no document. You don't have to fill out a piece of paper. I could write it on the back of a napkin. As long as I had the basic information, I could get that through. I should be able to get that through. So it's a little bit different. The thing to know is some of the countries have not yet undertaken what they need to accept that. So we've got some exceptions for Brunei, Malaysia, Mexico, Peru, and Vietnam. They have 5 years to make the regulations in place so that anybody can certify it. So we give them a little bit of a leeway. You got to keep your records for 5 years, just so you know. And then something that I wanted to raise, because it's very important having such a large agreement, is generally The language of the agreement says that for up to 1 year after you bring in your goods and make a claim of duty-free treatment, if for some reason somebody says your good doesn't qualify, you want to go back and, or you didn't have the paperwork, you didn't have a document, you didn't have an origin certificate or whatever, you can't claim entry immediately. They'll give you a year to make it up. Because there's 12 countries, and because we had this problem with the CAFTA, one of the things for folks in the room who are going to be working on the implementing language as we go forward is and for other countries, if you're looking at how to implement this, is that putting in something that allows, if you make an entry, and not everybody is yet a member, that until that final person or final country becomes a member, from that date you have 1 year to remedy your entry. And the reason I say this is because with the CAFTA, El Salvador became the first CAFTA country to implement the FTA, and it went live between the United States and El Salvador. Costa Rica didn't come on board until 2 years later. And the problem was goods were being made in El Salvador that were using sewing thread that was made in Costa Rica. Because that sewing thread was made in Costa Rica, goods that were made in El Salvador were disqualified and had to pay duties. But it took 2 years before they came on board. So as an importer, someone who made basically a good that qualified for duty-free treatment because of that sewing thread, I couldn't go back and claim and get duty-free treatment. So something to just keep on the radar screen for all of us wonks in here is when we're looking at the implementing language, that we've got to make sure that there's sufficient time when you have multiple parties and a rolling entry process. Just one other thing I want to touch on is the merchandise processing fee, and it's simply because it came up at an earlier WITA panel, and there were some discussions about it, and I just want to make sure folks understand the merchandise processing fee is a fee that everything pays when it comes in the United States, except for if it comes from certain free trade partners. And in the negotiations, we have decided, yeah, if it's a TPP or if it's an FTA good, it doesn't have to pay. Not so with the TPP. So there's going to be a merchandise processing fee, except the way it's applied right now is going to change, and it's going to change for all goods. So just so folks know, there still are going to be some additional fees that have to be paid, and you just need to be aware of those when they're coming in. I think I'll really stop with that because I could go on. I think I could have a full day panel on this, but I'll let Sean take it.
Thank you, Nicole. Sean, the investment chapter, a win for U.S. investors based on the model text?
Well,
Any changes?
I think so, Michael, and thank you and thank WITA for including us from USCIB in this.